The bandana was still folded the way I'd left it the morning before, sitting on the flat top of that old fir stump, grey with dew. I'd picked it up to shake it dry, and that's when I noticed Biscuit. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, all 10 years of him perfectly still, nose lifted, not making a sound. A blue tick that won't open his mouth at something in the trees is either very old and tired or paying the kind of attention that comes from something deeper than a training command. Biscuit was not tired. He was watching the hemlock line at the far end of the woodlot like it owed him something. I looked where he was looking. The hemlocks were dark even with the sky beginning to lighten behind me, their lower branches hanging still in air that had no wind in it. Nothing moved. Nothing I could name. I want to tell you that I felt something in that moment. I didn't exactly. What I felt was the absence of what I usually felt standing at that stump in the early morning, which was a low, hollow weight that I had gotten so accustomed to over 3 winters that I'd stopped recognizing it as grief and started thinking of it as weather. That absence was what stopped me. Not fear, not wonder, just the strange suspension of a pain I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten it had a name. To understand what I was looking at, you have to understand what the previous 3 years had looked like. And for that, I need to go back to the fall Deb died, and to what the 40 acres became after she was gone. I grew up in timber. Not the administrative end of it, not a desk and a board-foot spreadsheet, but the falling end, the chainsaw and the rigging and the particular arithmetic of a tree's lean and its weight distribution, and the exact angle of the back cut that would make it go where you needed it to go. I felled trees for the same outfit in the Coast Range of Oregon for 27 years, before my knees and my lower back signed a joint letter of resignation in 2012. After that, I worked a smaller scale, private land and millbid timber sales, and eventually it came down to just the 40 acres I'd owned since 1994, a piece of ground up off a gravel county road that Deb and I had bought together for $11,000, because the previous owner had logged it bare and nobody else wanted it. We planted it back out. That took several years of weekends and a lot of lower back work that even then was beginning to add up. By the time Deb got sick, the trees were 30 years old and coming into merchantable timber, and we'd built a small house at the clearing's edge that faced west toward the ridge. And the woodlot was how I heated the place, and how I kept my hands occupied in the months when the timber sales were slow. Deb had a ritual with the woodlot that I'd never asked for and never discouraged. Every morning I went out to split, she would bring coffee out to the old fir stump at the near end of the lot, the stump that had been there since before we bought the land, a big 3-foot diameter base from a tree that must have been 200 years old when someone put it down decades before us. She'd set her own cup on the stump and hold mine out to me when I stopped swinging. We rarely said much. It was cold most mornings, and her hands would be wrapped around her cup, and the steam would come up between us, and she would stand there watching me work with an expression I could not describe to you now, something between patience and pleasure, the look of a person who is exactly where they've decided to be. She died in February, 3 years before the October I'm talking about. Pancreatic cancer which moves at its own schedule and waits for nothing. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the end, and for 8 of those months she was well enough to stand at the stump some mornings. And for the last 3, she was not. I kept splitting wood through all of it, because there was always wood to split, and because I did not know what else to do with myself. After she was gone, I kept putting the coffee on. I'd carry 2 cups out of habit and set one on the stump and drink mine standing beside it, and then carry the second cup back inside, untouched. I did that for about 4 months before I understood what I was doing, and stopped. What I kept instead was a bandana, one of hers, a faded blue cotton square that she'd used to tie back her hair when she helped me stack. I started laying it on the stump each morning when I went out, smoothing it flat against the bark, and I never examined why I did it. It was the kind of thing a man does when he's run out of better ideas for managing what he's carrying. Roy knew about the bandana, or rather, Roy knew about his mother's death and about my general condition in the years following, which was a condition of functional withdrawal, the kind of grief that doesn't collapse a person so much as slowly sand down every rough edge that made them worth talking to. Roy was in Columbus, Ohio, working as a project manager for a construction company, married with 2 kids I'd seen in photographs and once in person. He called after the funeral and twice more in the first year, and I answered, but I didn't say much, and after a while the calls stopped. I didn't blame him. I had made myself into someone whose company cost more than it was worth. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a person who goes looking for things to believe in. I spent 27 years in the timber industry, and I can tell you that the woods will generate all the unusual sounds and shapes and shadows a person could want, and almost all of them have a straightforward explanation once you've been patient enough to wait for it. I've worked with men who startled at their own rigging, and men who spooked at elk in the dark, and I have always been someone who waited for the second look before I decided what I was seeing. I want you to understand that about me before I tell you what happened in October of the year I'm talking about, because what I'm about to describe does not have a straightforward explanation, and I have looked for one for the better part of a year. The first thing I noticed was Biscuit. Not on the day of the bandana, which I've already told you about. Before that. About a week into October, maybe 9 or 10 days before the morning I've opened with, I started noticing that Biscuit had developed a new habit. In the mornings when I went out to split, he would follow me to the stump the way he always had, settle himself in the dirt nearby, and then, at some point around first light, he would stand up and face the hemlock line at the far end of the lot and just hold there, nose up, not hackled, not growling, not making any sound at all. A blue tick who doesn't vocalize at a genuine threat is communicating something specific because the breed is built around its voice. The absence of that voice, I'd learned over 10 years with Biscuit, meant something that didn't match any threat category he'd been given. I told myself he was smelling elk. The Coast Range carries a healthy elk population, and a 10-year-old hound with a good nose would have a deep inventory of scents in that woodlot, most of them ordinary. Elk smelled different from deer, different from bear, different from the rotting windfall that accumulated at the property's lower corner. I told myself it was an elk standing close to the fence line upwind, and that Biscuit was simply orienting on the scent without an urge to pursue. That explanation held for 3 days. On the 4th day, I walked to the hemlock line myself during Biscuit's orientation window. First light, maybe 45 minutes after I'd started splitting. I walked the full length of the near edge, about 200 feet of heavy timber that my neighbour's fence marked on the south end and a dry stream bed marked on the north. I found elk sign, some beds in the fern layer fresh enough, and some tracks in the soft ground between the hemlocks. I found what I was looking for. I went back to splitting and felt satisfied. The elk explanation lasted until the morning I found the track beside the stump. This was maybe 5 days after my investigation of the hemlock line. I'd been splitting for about an hour, working through a round of red alder that I'd bucked up from a blowdown at the property's lower end, and I stopped to clear some bark chips from around the base of the stump. The ground there was soft clay, the kind that holds an impression the way plaster does, and when I crouched to brush the chips aside, I saw it. Not an elk track, not a bear track. I've tracked both through 30 years of working this land, and I know their shapes the way I know the shapes of my own tools. This was a footprint, a bipedal impression, heel to toe, perhaps 16 to 17 inches long and proportionately wide, pressed into the clay to a depth that implied a weight I did not want to estimate. 5 toes. No claw marks. The inside arch was shallower than a human arch, but present. It was a single track, or at least a single clearly legible one, the others either landing on harder ground or concealed by the bark chips I'd been clearing. I measured it against my own boot. My boot is a size 12, 11.5 inches from heel to toe. I put it beside the track and measured the difference with my handspan, and measured my handspan against the splitting maul handle. 16.5 inches, maybe 17. I did that measurement 3 times. The number didn't change. I stood up and looked at the hemlock line. Nothing there or nothing I could see. Biscuit was sitting 6 feet from the stump with his chin on his paws, watching me measure. I told myself it was a misshapen bear track, a front foot that had dragged or distorted in the clay. I told myself depth perception and distance had confused me about the shape. I told myself a man who has been alone on 40 acres for 3 years can develop a tendency to misread ordinary things. I went back to the house, drank a second cup of coffee standing at the kitchen window, and looked out at the woodlot for a long time. The track was still there when I went back to check it at midday. The clay had dried some around the edges, setting the impression more cleanly than it had been in the morning, and it was not a bear track. I don't know what else to tell you about that day. I went back to splitting, and I watched the hemlock line more than I needed to, and Biscuit never moved from his spot near the stump until I carried the last round inside. If you're the kind of person who keeps watching these stories, you probably know the feeling I'm describing. Not fear exactly, more like the slow erosion of a working assumption you hadn't realized you were relying on. Drop a comment below if you know that feeling. I've found it helps to know someone else has been there. The woodpile was what broke the second explanation. I had been working on a particular section of the woodlot's east side, a stand of mature fir I'd decided to thin for the sake of the younger trees, crowding underneath. I'd felled and bucked 3 trees over 2 days, cut everything into 18-inch rounds, and had about a third of a cord stacked near the eastern fence in a loose pile waiting to be properly split and stacked. I'd left it that way at the end of a Friday, planning to finish it over the weekend. The pile was not stacked, not organized, just rounds tossed roughly against the fence, the way a person ends a long day of physical work without the energy for the finishing details. Saturday morning, I went out early, before full light, with the splitting maul and my lamp. I came around the east end of the lot toward that pile and stopped at the fence corner because what I was looking at was not a loose pile of rounds. It was a stacked cord, or most of one. Split, not round. Each piece set flat, bark side out, the sections tight enough to shed rain, the rows level. The rounds I had left against the fence the previous afternoon had been split and stacked and arranged in the specific way that good firewood storage requires, which I knew about and practiced, and which Deb had learned from me and eventually became more consistent about than I was. Bark side out is not an instinct. It's a practice. You do it because the bark sheds water and the end grain absorbs it, and if you stack it wrong, you're letting moisture wick into the wood from 2 directions instead of 1. I had told Deb this in the 2nd year we lived here, and she had remembered it every time afterward, and occasionally corrected my own stacking when I got sloppy at the end of a long day. She would set a piece back down and turn it without comment, just the motion of a hand repositioning wood, and I would watch it happen and not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Every piece in that Saturday morning stack was bark side out. I stood at that fence for a long time. I went through the bear explanation again, this time in the full knowledge of how far it had already failed me. Bears do not stack firewood. I went through the explanation that I had perhaps split and stacked the wood myself in a fatigue-induced fugue I'd forgotten, which lasted about 30 seconds against the reality of how sore my arms were from 2 days of felling and bucking without any of the soreness that comes from an additional session of splitting. I went through the explanation that a neighbour might have done it, which required a neighbour who had access to my property at night, who knew the bark side out practice, and who had chosen to help me without leaving any track in the soft ground along the fence that I could identify as a boot. There were no boot tracks. There were 2 depressions in the soft earth on the outside of the fence that might have been the edges of large flat feet, pressing down and pushing off, but the ground was firmer there and I could not make them into anything definite. I'm not a person who enjoys not understanding things. I spent my working life in an environment where not understanding the physics of a falling tree could kill you, and I developed a strong preference for clarity about what was in front of me. Standing at that fence on a cold October Saturday with a cord of wood stacked in a way I had not stacked it, I felt something I'd felt only a few times before in my life, which was the specific discomfort of a category failing. The feeling of reaching for the familiar drawer and finding the drawer is no longer where the dresser was. I went back to work. That's what I do when I don't know what else to do. I split another 2 hours, refilled the stump split supply, set Deb's bandana flat on the bark, the way I always did. Biscuit sat with his nose toward the hemlocks and said nothing. The partial glimpse came that evening. I had stayed later than usual in the woodlot, working in the slant of a sun that was dropping fast behind the ridge, the light going that specific October amber that the Coast Range makes in the last 20 minutes of a clear afternoon. I was carrying an armload of split fir toward the house when I crossed the middle of the clearing, and the angle of the light changed as I moved, and I saw, for roughly 2 seconds, something at the far edge of the hemlock stand. Large, dark, standing upright at a height that put its upper body in the lower branches of the hemlocks, branches that cleared 8 feet at their lowest point on that end of the lot. It was not still the way a tree is still. It was still the way a large animal is still when it has decided to be, which is a different quality of stillness entirely, the kind that has weight and attention behind it rather than simple absence of movement. I saw the mass of it against the dark interior of the stand, and then the light shifted as I took another step, and the shape resolved back into shadow and hemlock trunks. I stopped walking. I set the fur down without thinking about it. I looked at the hemlocks for 4 or 5 minutes without moving, and Biscuit came and stood beside my left knee and put his nose up, and did not make a sound. The light went all the way down, and I carried the fur inside and did not look back. I spent that evening at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink, going through the inventory of large animals that could stand upright in the Coast Range of Oregon in October, which is a short list. Black bear will stand to investigate. An upright black bear at close range is an impressive shape, but the upper profile is wrong. Too round at the shoulder, the arms carried too far forward when it stands. What I had seen for 2 seconds at the hemlock line was standing the way a person stands, weight distributed, upright without the forward lean a bear carries. And it was larger than any bear I had tracked or seen in 30 years of working in Coast Range timber. I went to bed without having arrived anywhere conclusive. I lay awake for a while listening to Biscuit breathe on his rug at the foot of the bed, and, eventually, I slept. The following morning was the morning I've told you about, the one I started with. I was out before first light, which was my habit. The temperature was in the low 40s, a clear sky beginning to grey in the east, frost on the grass at the clearing's edge and on the bark of the stump. I'd poured 1 cup of coffee and carried it with me, and Biscuit had come out onto the porch and then followed me across the clearing without his usual ranging. He stayed close, maybe 10 feet off my left side, and he was already facing the hemlocks before I'd set the bandana on the stump. I picked up the splitting maul, and I began to work. There is a quality of silence that happens in the Coast Range at that hour on a clear October morning that I've tried to describe to people, and mostly failed. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of a particular soundscape. The pre-dawn bird layer settling before the daytime birds start, the specific creak of cooling timber, the occasional small noise of something moving in the fern understory. Once you've listened to that soundscape for enough years, it becomes a reference track you carry in the background of your attention. And what I noticed as I worked that morning was that the reference track had gone quiet in the hemlock end of the lot. Not entirely quiet, but the low layer of small movement sounds that usually came from that direction had stopped. The hemlocks were holding their breath. I kept swinging. Maul up, weight forward, the round splitting clean along the grain. I set the halves against the stump and put another round on the block. Biscuit had moved without my noticing to a position about 5 feet in front of me and slightly to the left, sitting upright, facing the hemlock line, his whole body oriented forward, not hackled, ears up and forward, nose working in slow, patient pulls of air. I set them all down. The light was up enough now that the far end of the clearing was fully visible, the frost-white grass running from where I stood to the hemlock stand, maybe 60 yards, and at the edge of the hemlocks, standing at the threshold where the open ground met the first line of trunks, was a shape that did not belong to the woods in any category I had ever used. It was standing in the open, or almost in the open, the way something stands when it has made a deliberate choice to be visible. The hemlocks were behind it, dark interior behind its mass, and the morning light was coming over my right shoulder and falling on the near side of it at an angle that gave it definition. I can tell you it was large in a way that reorganizes your understanding of large. 7, 8 feet, probably more. Dark, covered in something that caught the low light as texture rather than sheen, a deep brown black that looked dense and heavy, and completely unlike the thin fur of a bear. It stood with its weight distributed evenly, arms at its sides, not moving, not advancing, not retreating. Its head was turned toward me. I have tried many times since then to describe what I felt in that moment, and I keep arriving at the same inadequacy. There are experiences that sit outside the language you've been given, and you spend a long time circling them looking for a door in. What I can tell you is that my body did not move into fear. There was a quickening, the heart doing what hearts do when the scale of something exceeds what the brain had prepared for. But it was not the fear I felt standing too close to a falling tree or working a bad road in a loaded truck. It was something closer to the feeling of being addressed, of being looked at by something that was looking at me specifically. Biscuit had not moved. His tail was loose, not rigid, his ears still forward, his breathing even. A blue tick who trusts what his nose tells him will stay calm when the message isn't threat. And Biscuit had apparently decided several mornings ago what message he was receiving. That calm, more than anything, kept my feet where they were. We stayed like that for what felt like a long time. Long enough that the light continued to shift, the frost beginning to soften at the edges of the grass, the sky in the east going from grey to pale gold. I was cold and my hands were still on the maul handle, and I was watching this thing watch me and trying to understand what the moment was. Then it moved, not toward me, not rapidly. It turned at the waist, a slow, deliberate turn, and leaned down to the ground beside it, and when it straightened, it was holding a single piece of split firewood. I recognized the cut of it, red, older, from the rounds I'd been working. It held the piece in one hand the way I might hold a book. Then it walked forward, not all the way across the clearing, Not close, maybe 10 or 12 steps, enough to close perhaps a quarter of the distance between the hemlocks and the stump where I was standing. It was slow in every movement, not cautious exactly, more the way something moves when it intends to be understood rather than when it intends to be fast. It stopped, set the piece of firewood down, upright, balanced on its flat split end on the top of the old fir stump, beside the bandana. Then it straightened and looked at me again. I am not a man who cries easily. I have not said that to impress you. I say it because what happened next surprised me as much as anything else that morning had. The piece of firewood standing on that stump, placed beside the bandana the way a person places something beside something they've found and decided to honor, that image went somewhere in my chest that I hadn't been able to reach in 3 years of splitting wood alone in the cold. Something in the architecture of the gesture matched something that had been waiting for a match for a very long time. Deb used to set things on that stump. Coffee cups, work gloves she'd been folding to carry back to the house. Once a small cluster of wild columbine she'd found at the field edge and brought over without saying why. Objects placed there with quiet intention, the stump being the place where the domestic world and the working world met, and she had always seemed to understand that without my having explained it. The thing standing 60 yards away in the morning light had placed something on that stump with the same quality of intention. I could not explain how it knew, and I have not tried very hard since then to construct an explanation, because the explanations I could reach were less true than the plain fact of what I had seen. It turned and walked back to the hemlocks. No hurry, no display. It reached the tree line, and in 2 or 3 steps the dark of the stand took it, and the hemlocks were the hemlocks again, nothing in them that I could separate from shadow and bark. Biscuit let out a long, slow breath through his nose and lay down in the frost. I stood at the splitting block for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough that the frost was fully off the clearing grass, and the morning birds had started up in the fir stand to the south. Then I walked over to the stump, and I stood there looking at the piece of alder standing upright on the bark, beside Deb's bandana. I did not move either object. I put my hand on the stump beside them on the cold grey bark, and I stayed there with my palm flat on the wood for a long time. Then I went inside and I picked up the phone. Roy answered on the 4th ring. I heard the particular quality of caution in his voice that I had put there over 3 years, of not calling, the careful neutrality of a person who doesn't know yet what kind of conversation this is going to be. I didn't have a speech prepared. I hadn't rehearsed anything. I said his name, and then I said I was sorry it had taken me this long, and then I didn't say anything else for a moment because the sentence didn't have a clean end. Roy was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Dad." That was it. Just that. We talked for about 40 minutes, which is longer than we'd talked cumulatively in the previous 2 years. I told him some of what the last 3 winters had been like. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough that he understood something he hadn't understood before. He told me about his kids, about his work, about the thing his oldest had said at dinner 2 weeks before that had made him think of his mother. I listened. I sat down at the kitchen table and drank my cold coffee and listened to my son talk about Deb the way people talk about someone they are still actively carrying. Before we hung up, Roy said he might come out in the spring. I said I'd have the porch in shape by then. I have not told Roy about what happened in the woodlot that morning. Not because I think he wouldn't believe me. I think Roy is a person who would want to believe me, which is almost the same thing, and I don't want to hand him an obligation of belief that might get between him and the actual fact of what his mother's death and my disappearance afterward did to us. The story about the woodlot is mine to carry, and I carry it fine. What mattered was that something in me that had been locked at the bottom of a long, hard season came loose that morning, and the phone call was the first thing I did with the looseness. I don't have a clean explanation for what I saw. I've thought about it enough times in the months since then that I've worn the edges off the question and stopped expecting an answer to come from any direction I can see. What I know is what I observed, and I was trained by 30 years of timber work to observe carefully. The track was 16.5 inches. The woodpile was stacked bark side out by something that understood why it mattered. The piece of alder was placed on that stump with intention, beside a folded bandana, at a height and angle that suggested the thing placing it knew what the stump was. That last part is the part I can't account for, and I've stopped trying. The following spring, Roy came out for a week in late April. I had the porch in shape, as promised, new decking and a coat of stain, and we spent most of the first day doing very little, sitting in the chairs Deb and I had kept out there for 20 years, drinking coffee, watching Biscuit move across the clearing with the stiff-hipped walk of an old dog who is still willing. Roy asked about the stump at some point, the big old fir stump at the near end of the lot. I told him it had been there since before we bought the land, that it was probably from a tree felled 40 or 50 years before that. He went over and looked at it, ran his hand across the bark the way people do with old wood, the way they might with an old animal or an old piece of furniture, looking for the weight of time in the texture. The bandana was still there. I'd left it through the winter, through the rain and the frost, and the few inches of snow the ridge had put down in January. It was faded darker from the weather, the blue gone almost to grey, the fabric softened, but still folded, still in its place. Roy didn't ask about it, and I didn't explain it. He just set his coffee cup on the stump beside it for a minute, while he stood there looking across the lot, and then he picked the cup back up and walked back to the porch and sat down. It was the kind of thing his mother would have done without thinking about it. The cup beside the bandana, just for a moment before the day moved on. I split a cord before breakfast most mornings that week, which is not a small amount of work, and which Roy was not prepared for when he came out the second morning and found me already 2 hours in. He watched me work for a while from the porch, drinking his coffee, and eventually he came out and asked if he could take a turn. I handed him the maul and watched him figure out the balance of it, the way a person who didn't grow up with this work has to find the swing through trial and error, and I thought about the years I had not been here to hand him anything. He was slow, and he tired quickly, but he kept at it. And by the end of the morning we had most of a cord split and stacked along the east fence, bark side out, and I'd shown him why without making a lesson out of it. Biscuit was on the porch step when we came back in, watching the hemlocks the way he'd watched them all winter. Nose up, tail easy. That patient attention that I had long since stopped trying to explain. He's 10 years old and his hips won't carry him far on a cold morning, but he still comes out to the stump with me each day. Still takes his position facing the tree line at first light. Still holds that silence with the particular quality of something that knows more than it can tell. Some mornings I find a small thing, a cone arranged at the base of the stump, a piece of bark set upright in the dirt. I don't make more of these things than they are, and I don't make less of them. I note them the way I note a change in the weather or the lean of a tree, as information that goes into the record I keep in my head about the 40 acres and what lives on them. There is something at the edge of that hemlock stand that has been paying attention to this woodlot, and to me in it, for at least as long as I've been paying attention to it. Maybe longer. I don't know what it is, and I've made my peace with not knowing. I know what it did on one October morning at a fir stump in the Oregon Coast Range, and I know what that act cost it in terms of concealment, and I know what the act was worth to a 58-year-old man standing there with his hands on a splitting maul, trying to figure out how to keep going. That's a thing I can tell you plainly without having to explain what anything means. Roy went back to Columbus on a Saturday morning in late April, and I drove him to the airport in the truck and shook his hand at the drop-off curb. And then I drove back up the county road and parked in front of the house and went out to the woodlot. The morning was clear, the hemlocks washed in spring light, the ground soft from the April rain. The bandana was on the stump the way it always was. Biscuit came across the clearing and settled himself in the new grass a few feet away. His nose went up, his tail was loose. The hemlocks were quiet and present and dark at their center, and full of whatever they had always been full of. I picked up the maul, and I split wood until the morning was gone, and it was the first time in 3 years that the splitting felt like something other than waiting.